Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we're talking the forgotten voters of the Midwest and why they hold the keys to the White House. We'll also be busting the myths on electric vehicles. What happens when the money runs out? People talk about polling in the Northeast, they talk about it in the West, and sometimes they talk about it in the South. But so rarely do we hear about what's happening in the Midwest. We're very fortunate to have with us author of the longest running and most popular column on the pages of LibertyNation.com, From the Back 40, Miss Sarah Cowgill. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, Sarah, I love polls, as you know, and I dig into them all the time. And what I see is that everybody focuses on the East Coast, the West Coast and the Northeast, and nobody really pays attention to the Midwest. But for so many reasons, it's the most important of the areas in the country. Now, why is that?
Well, number one, you have all the swing states are all Midwestern, well, except for Pennsylvania, but, sort of, kind of.
Pennsylvania's that's the big argument, isn't it? Is it Midwest? It's about as close to Midwest as you can get.
Not necessarily. I don't think the Midwest is going to claim them, and I don't think Pennsylvania wants to be claimed by the Midwest. But, you have Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, and I mean, I live in a fairly predominant red state with blue speckled, large cities. But the Midwest itself, you got Arizona on the western end of us, and they are going to swing this election, and it's more important to talk to them if you want the real news. If you want to pad your, poll for either side of the aisle, then go to those places. If you really want to hear what the whole world's going to say come November 5th, you probably ought to pay attention to Middle America.
I mean, that's really the thing, isn't it? We hear so many of the loudest and most, what's the right word here? I don't want to be insulting. Let's just be insulting. The loudest and most shrieking voices come from the coasts. You've got the West Coast, you've got the Northeast up there, and they dominate the media discussion. And they also, in many ways, they dominate the political discussion because they're the largest population areas. And yet, we know which way they're voting because they have done since, well, at least since 30 years, they've been locked in as what they are. And so the battlegrounds, the Midwest areas, these are the ones where you've still got actual political independence, independence of a sizable enough majority that they're going to make a difference in who occupies the White House. And so it does strike me as almost a fatal oversight in polling that it's not just focused on the Midwest. They do the occasional battlegrounds. Like, oh, we're going to do 80 polls in Pennsylvania. You need the whole plethora of places, though. You're there, you write about this area. I mean, it's a great column, by the way. Listeners, go and check it out. LibertyNation.com. Longest running, most popular one. You really get insight into what's happening. What are they feeling, do you think, these independents in the Midwest?
Well, I can tell you 6 months ago, everybody was tired of politics as usual, tired of the rhetoric, tired of the misinformation that is just constantly not fact-checked on some people and overly fact-checked on others. Everybody was just getting burned out. And I find these out because I travel the Midwest quite frequently, back and forth, at least, New Mexico, all of these great areas, Oklahoma. And I talk to people everywhere I go, and they were burned out. And all of a sudden, it kind of came after the assassination attempt on Trump, but all of a sudden there was this voice, and it started to pick up rhythm in the Midwest. And it's an unusual voice, and it's two Democrats, and it's RFK Jr. and
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard. And that all of a sudden people went, okay, maybe, just maybe, we need more of a centralized centrist platform. Maybe
Yeah.
that's what we want. And both Republicans and Democrats and independents are talking about that. And that has created a vibe and an energy of positivity that nobody's seen in a while.
Yeah, with the RFK thing, the polling was early polling was showing that he was between 10 and 15%. We were almost talking Ross Perot territory. But
Mhm.
then everybody tried to sue him and to keep him out of the states and to keep him off the ballot. And then, of course, he joined the Trump train, as it were.
Mhm.
And it's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Because just a Kennedy name, I mean, that carries weight. And the son of Robert F. Kennedy, the nephew of John F. Kennedy, I mean,
Mhm.
that's a lot of weight to be carrying. And to be on the Trump train, I think that's going to be a silent percentage that doesn't get talked about up until the election. And I suspect, and it might not swing the election, but I suspect it'll make it an incredibly close contest.
I believe that a couple of weeks ago there was an event called Rescue the Republic.
Mm.
And it was a cornucopia of independents and Democrats that have walked away from the Democratic Party and MAGA hat wearing Trump people. And they all came together with this kind of new coalition. And it was really a fascinating event to see. You know, there's maybe 100,000 people there, and in unity. None of these people were fighting. Nobody was calling anybody a, conspiracy theorist. It was quite interesting. And Tulsi Gabbard pointed out that, Dick Cheney is now Kamala
Mm.
Harris's hero. And that went over like a not well. I'm glad
Thank
I
you for
stopped myself
considering our
there.
radio
I didn't
audience.
want not well. And when you see that, and you see these people not not being Trump acolytes, but being for the government and the we the people that is seems to be missing in this country, that was something kind of important. And I think that movement is becoming less and less silent and censored. I don't think they can keep a lid on it. And those people were from all over. Alaska was there, California was there. There were people all over it. But the majority of people that are embracing this centrist type of political ideology, they're here in the Midwest.
Mm.
And that's going to be an important factor, whether anybody wants to talk about it or not.
Yeah, I think the what's happening is that the actual center. So for many years, sure you're aware, we've had certain parties saying, "Oh, we are the center," and that's never actually been the center. It's always been either the radical left saying, "Oh, this is where the new center is," or it's the I don't want to say far right, but let's say more stringent right of American politics. Saying
There's
that,
a radical right out
yeah,
there.
yeah,
We can all agree there's a
sure,
radical right.
and they've been pushing it.
They're a very small percentage of that
Yeah,
right, though.
yeah, that's true. On the left, the radical left is a lot more
Hmm.
cumbersome, I guess, a lot more weighty
Yes.
than the radical right.
Yeah.
But each side's been pulling, saying that no, the center's closer over here, and they've been pulling it away from where the actual real center used to be. And by that, I guess I'm talking Bill Clinton, that kind of
Yeah.
center.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and so it's being pulled away from that. And so I don't think that, well, no, I do think that there is going to be some, no matter what happens, if Kamala Harris wins the 2020 election, I suspect she'll govern on a fairly radical left platform to appease the people who got her there. And then there'll be a pushback against her, and that will pull it back to the center in the future, maybe in 4 years or 8 years. And if Donald Trump wins, I suspect if he goes uh, ahead with many or most of the things that he's been putting out, I think there'll be a pullback as well, where people say, maybe that's a little too far to operate. And it will come back to the center. I mean, I hope that it comes back to center because the
Well,
center is where things happen.
Trump seems to be forging a coalition
Mm.
of people who aren't yes men.
Yes.
And that is
I said yes. Who aren't yes,
yes,
man?
yes. Well, you can be my yes man today, but no, that seems to be something that people in the Midwest like. I mean, they're common sense folks here. They know better than to say I get $25,000 free without strings attached. They know this. And so to see a candidate that they were maybe debating like Trump, and there's plenty of Democrats around here kind of going, well, I don't know that much about Kamala. I don't understand her policies. So, with that going on, and you get these people that come in and kind of clear that thought of how to do it. Kennedy's a how to do it guy. Nikki Haley is a how to do it girl. Tulsi Gabbard is a how to do it girl. So you've got people that are they're not yes man, but they're being embraced in this, new MAGA movement. So I'm thinking there's going to be a little change in the scenery.
Well, we'll see what happens with that, and we'll be back with Sarah Cowgill after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we remain joined by Liberty Nation author of the longest running, most popular column on the page of libertynation.com, Sarah Cowgill. Now, earlier, Sarah, we were talking about the Midwest, how those voters are feeling, what's the importance of them in the presidential contest. But now I want to draw a bit on your own experience as an actual campaigner on presidential campaigns and kind of see what you think about how the campaigns for the two main candidates now are working compared to your own experience. If you could give us a background on your own experience.
Well, it's been a few years. The last presidential race I worked on was John McCain in 2000. But campaigning has completely changed in the last 2 decades. I mean, we didn't have the social media access that we have. People weren't doing podcasts. There was no Liberty Nation news sites where all of these people can have a platform. So you're still working with the big 3 networks and CNN, Fox News. Those were your go-to for what you wanted to see in 2000. The people haven't changed, however. They want to know how things are going. So when you have the Harris Waltz people on the move, Waltz will talk your ear off. I mean, he seems to be ready to go and has relatively a good grasp on what his policies have been and how to explain those. Now, yes, they are completely radical, but he has them, and he has a reason and an ability to say, here's how I'm going to do it, because he has done it as governor. Now, Kamala does not have that ability, and she freezes and she cannot answer questions. If there's a follow-up question, she can't answer it. So you're going to see her less and less in the limelight on any interview in front of people one-on-one or at a rally, unless she's tightly scripted and not allowed to engage with the press. And now, Trump, on the other hand, he's got surrogates as well. I mean, everybody has surrogates because you can't be everywhere at once. His surrogates have a different approach, and that approach is to literally tell you how they're going to do it, which you have that information. And, when you say, how can you promise all this stuff? And you say, well, I grew up middle class and we mowed our lawn. That's not going to cut it. The audience is well educated, and most people have decided who they want to stick with. But at the same time, there's independents out there that are going to go, oh, well, that makes sense to me, versus that didn't make any sense to me. And that's the 2 different campaigns you're seeing. Somebody laying out the plan with how you're going to do it, what I'm going to start with, and Harris Waltz just kind of not having a plan. They have goals, unreachable.
Goals are not a plan. Yeah.
No plan to get there. I mean, how are you going to get there? Well, I don't know. We're Americans. We're just being American. I've never been so confused in my life.
You
And
know,
really she's had plenty of time to, adjust and learn and create a map for people to follow. And there is no map. There's no GPS on Harris.
that's
Nothing.
good. I might use that for the title for this segment. Now, I think it's interesting that you talk about the surrogates there. I think that's actually quite fascinating because each side does have its surrogates, and the greatest surrogates that each side has are their VP candidates, right? They're there
Yes.
standing in for the presidential contender at rallies, speaking
Hmm.
presumably with the president's voice, with the potential president's voice. Um, now, I think that you're absolutely right about there being a communications issue with uh, Kamala Harris campaign, not just through Tim Walz. Two interesting factors for you here. I'll just do them very, very quickly. If you do a Google Trend search for the last 90 days for Vance versus Waltz, what you find is that in every state except for Minnesota, uh, Vance, his name, is being searched more in Google, and it's just Minnesota, and it's an exact replica. I think it was of the Walter Mondale loss, where he just
Hmm.
won Minnesota, and it's that compared to that. So nobody really knows who Vance is, and it seems the only people searching for his name are those people. Sorry, not Vance. Sorry, who Waltz is. The only people searching for his name are the very people who are paying his salary, which should be concerning in itself. And the other aspect is about communication. Is Kamala Harris came out of the first and possibly only presidential debate, um, regarded as the victor. But then if you look at the polling, and I'm thinking Pennsylvania here, because that really is the keystone state in this election. If you look at I think I'm getting this right. Please do forgive me if I'm off fractionally. If you look at the last 12 polls, national polls, sorry, polls that concern Pennsylvania, that were done from the 12th of September onwards, that was after the debate,
Hmm.
she only wins in one out of the last 12, which is kind of crazy, right? Because she won that debate according to pretty much everybody. And yet
Yes, I would say she won the debate,
there
but
were a
she
lot of
didn't.
ties, by the way. I should
But
point out a lot of ties.
it wasn't a real. It was more the other team just kind of didn't show up, and I do. Everybody has a bad day. We've all we've all seen candidates do the dumbest things on a live debate stage, but I think Trump was still trying to debate Joe Biden, and here
Mm,
he had Harris, and I don't think he performed at all. It
right.
was like he called it in, and she didn't. She was prepared and ready to go. She didn't answer any specific questions.
Of
She
course.
had two people helping her fact check,
Mm.
but she looked presidential, and he looked out of sorts. Okay, well, like when Reagan debated Mondale, they were ready for each other, and that turned the whole election upside down. So that's where you're at with these two campaigns. It's I don't know. Anything can
Anybody,
happen. Where's the October surprise?
anybody's to win, anybody's to lose. Sarah Cowgill, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Are electric vehicles all they've cracked up to be, and do they fulfill the promise for which billions of dollars of US taxpayer money are being sequestered? We're very fortunate to have with us somebody who has followed the topic, the subject, and the science quite deep into the rabbit hole. National correspondent for LibertyNation.com, Mr. John Clark. Thanks for being here, John.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So, John, let's talk about electric vehicles, specifically cars, but also perhaps we could delve a little further into the trucking fleets as we go down there. Now, the big selling point of EV cars is that they're good for the environment. Is that accurate?
Well, it is not. And the argument is that EV cars use less carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases over the useful life of their operation than gas-powered cars. And that may be true. I think that itself is a dubious claim. In fact, the EPA has at its website, you can go there and it says myths about EV cars. And it says this is not true because even if you account for the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that are generated in the manufacture of batteries, which some have complained about, then still EV cars over their useful life use less or emit fewer greenhouse gases. They have no tailpipes, and so they're wonderful. The problem with the EPA's website is that they have excluded non-greenhouse gas emissions, many of which are toxins. Okay, carbon dioxide is called a pollution now since Al Gore came to the fore on the climate, but carbon dioxide is essential for all life, plant and animal. In fact, increased carbon dioxide levels are increasing crop yields in many parts of the world. So it's not all a bad thing, but carbon dioxide doesn't cause cancer. It's not an endocrine disruptor. It doesn't kill the microbiome of the human gut and the soil. And so if you start looking at these other chemicals, EV cars have specific aspects in manufacturing that are very different from gas-powered vehicles and generate enormous quantities of these other chemicals. And it's kind of really a blow to those who have invested not just their money, but their faith in EV cars to save us from the pollution, to find out that lithium mining is absolutely destroying the water and the soil, one of the most toxic enterprises in the world ever by human activity. And it's exploding exponentially to build batteries that create more pollution on their disposal. And we haven't even got into the rubber tire issue, which has been largely ignored as well. And it's a huge pollution problem. So I have no bone in this fight other than to try to actually reduce the toxins that will give my grandchildren cancer. And reducing carbon dioxide without regard to these ecotoxins is, I think, a farce, if not a deliberate lie.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you raise about the benefits of carbon dioxide here, because we have witnessed across the globe that there's an immense greening of the globe, which can only be good, really, because they produce air. It's almost like it's a cleaning system for the environment. And when you have massive tracts of brand new green land, trees, forests, grasslands, that can only be a net benefit to humanity. And it seems that the idea of cutting back on our carbon to such an extent where you're jeopardizing that, it seems a foolhardy venture, excuse me, at least on that level. Let's talk about the tires that you just mentioned, because this is one of the areas that hardly ever gets discussed. And I think it's possibly one of the most significant in the EV debate, isn't it, John?
Well, yeah. And if I could just address something you've mentioned there, as far as areas being greened up by increasing levels of carbon dioxide and whether or not and how much of that is attributable to human conduct.
Sure.
To say it's on net balance, I mean, that is the question. I think there are other areas where perhaps these are not helpful for our cropping and farmland. But what you've pointed out is that we only hear one side of the equation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they only look at potential negatives, and they are a range of possibilities, not these certainties. We're told that, the ice cap's going to be gone on November 27th. I mean, it's reduced to these alarmisms that do help sell products, by the way. They help sell renewable energy products. And one of the things that's been sort of nagging at my brain as I try to think critically over the years is this rubber tire thing you mentioned. And I had seen some years ago that these cars burn 30% more in rubber. They go through tires 30% faster. That seems to be the low end. I've seen some other studies or claims that it's as much as 50%. And initially I thought, well, that's going to make them more expensive because a lot of people are looking at the cost. These are very expensive vehicles. But even if you bring these costs down, what are the environmental costs if we look past the carbon dioxide? And so I didn't even realize until some recent studies have come out that rubber pollution from tires is not just, they wore out, you have to throw them in the landfills and get rid of the tires now. Farmers here in Vermont, by the way, when we had a lot of farms, they use them on their silage pits to hold the silage down for the winter. So I could always give away my tires. Just go to a farmer, they'll thank you for them. But what we find out is that the real pollution from those tires isn't when they hit the landfill, it's when they're being driven and they release particularized or particulate, I don't know what you call it, particulate matter of rubber. Now, these cars, the EV cars, apparently it's because they have increased torque. That was the other reason. Like, well, why would they go through it faster? Do they turn at a different radius? Well, they have engines that can generate energy much more quickly. They go faster off the starting gate, which is creating safety issues as well because they're quiet as well, not really good for pedestrians. But this is why they burn more rubber. And this rubber is not just rubber, it has heavy metals in it. It has all kinds of petroleum byproducts in it. And it is now, according to a recent study, contributing to 6.6 million tons a year of airborne particles that we're all driving around generating. I'm not sure we want to increase that 30 to 50% overnight in our lust to stop carbon dioxide. This is not net pollution. It might be net carbon, net zero. Even if it is, I'm saying it's not net rubber. It's far more rubber. It's far more lithium. And it's now being attributed to being caused 78% of all of the microplastic pollution in our oceans from tires alone. Now, whether those numbers come into further criticism, if we're going to increase that by 30 to 50%, maybe we should have a discussion about something other than just carbon dioxide. And maybe the EPA should extend its myths about EVs to actually embrace these very real scientific concerns. This is very real environmentalism here, looking at ecotoxins and not just carbon dioxide.
Yeah, I think it's what Liberty Nation senior political analyst likes to call one-step thinking, and it's quite inherent in a certain political mindset that they have a solution. That, well, here's a solution. We want to reduce the carbon footprint, therefore we'll go for EV cars because they don't put out all these carbon dioxide, and yet they don't consider what other toxins are being put out, nor the offset things through brake dust, through tire particulate matter, and all these things. As you say, you've got to look at it at a balance. So which one actually works out the best? And I don't think we'll come up with the definitive answer on that, but it seems to me that the shelf life of an electric vehicle is much shorter than that of a standard gas-powered car, isn't it?
Well, there's so much bad information coming down now that we've got past the first step of the sales pitch. Okay. Their resale values are terrible. A lot of people don't want them. They don't really work as well as advertised. I've heard more and more consumer reports are showing people are not happy with them. They don't charge well in the cold. They don't have potentially enough charging stations. We're told that we have, I think Bill Gates recently said that we have to triple the size of the electric grid in the country, but partly because of climate policies that have intruded upon that industry's ability to repair and maintain its grid line. We've been expanding the grid in America at the lowest rate perhaps in our history. So there are some logistical problems here that mean that even if they do work well, and then, by the way, they end up in the landfills again, it's not just the lithium production that you have to dispose of it all. And the recycling, there are different methods for recycling. They all create more pollution. So actually, I disagree with you. I think as we apply our second step and invite people who already are to look at these things critically, that we can say unequivocally that EV cars are far more deleterious to the ecosystem than the gas-powered cars we're told they're going to replace. Just follow the money, by the way, and you could see why some people might have a little bit of a bias here. But if you just look at the lithium and the rubber alone, they are an absolute environmental nightmare, being heavily subsidized regressively on the taxpayer tab, borrowed money, and we don't have an alternate plan. And it doesn't even look like they would work. It literally looks like we cannot build out the grid. And you mentioned EV trucks. Once again, the logistics become impossible. It's one thing to dream something, it's another to build it.
Well, we'll be talking about the infrastructure in place and the infrastructure that's not in place after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's national correspondent, John Clark. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the myths surrounding electric vehicle productions. Now, John, I want to delve a little more deeply into the infrastructure that's required to achieve the all sales of electric vehicles by 2030, or the increase in sales of electric vehicles by 2030 that's being touted by the current government. And we discussed it very, very briefly, but it seems that the infrastructure that would be needed to accommodate for that is not on a pace to keep up with it. In fact, it would fall far behind at current building operations, wouldn't it?
Well, again, there are logistics involved in manufacturing anything. And one of the key input points here is lithium. And so when you ask this question, we have competing demands worldwide for those resources. And here in this country, between various utopian plans to implement an EV universe. So California is mandating an electric truck fleet, which alone would consume pretty much all of the lithium currently created or produced in the world for like the next 30 years. So, but that's supposed to be implemented, I think, by 2035 or 40. I wrote a piece about it for Liberty Nation so people can go there to see. Now, Tim Waltz has said that I think Minnesota is supposed to be entirely EV cars by 2030, as you mentioned. It's impossible. And so when you pass laws to mandate things that are impossible, I think you're going to run into a problem. And actually, you start to undermine public trust in lawmaking, and the costs that are involved and the reliability issues. So what you've asked is, where are the different points of failure? Studies are showing that the EV charging stations are still not fully reliable. They certainly don't work well in the cold. The cold snap last year, most EV cars are out in California. And the cold snap found people in America stranded on the side of the road. Their cars wouldn't charge at all. The charging stations didn't work. Here in Vermont, we had people come up with the Eclipse, and they found there were nowhere near enough charging stations. They drove up here in droves, I think 200,000 people for the day. Many ended up having to stay the night when they were backed up in long queues to charge their cars. Now the question is, will this ever be feasible? And as we've discussed, the grid capacity required is monumental. The grid is already weak. And the question is whether it can sustain it. And of course, that grid then needs to be charged with what? Fossil fuels or maybe, nuclear. So when you start adding up all these costs and all these problems, and we're not talking about the environmental costs now, which we've already concluded without any question are really, well, how about worth a more thorough analysis and look before we, hit the pedal on production. But when you similarly look at the problems with the feasibility, the trucks, if we, just for an example, if we convert our tractor trailer truck system to electric batteries, so much of the tow load is going to be subsumed by the battery itself. It's going to weigh like 2,000 pounds. We haven't even got into the problems of producing it, where that amount of lithium is going to come from and where it's going to go. But literally, the trucking industry is in crisis. They already operate on small margins. The charging stations are going to cost billions of dollars. It is absolutely impossible, but it's making a lot of people a real lot of money in the short term before we figure out at step 2 thinking that it doesn't work.
Yeah, that does seem to be the main issue, that you have this utopian ideal that everything will be electric without questioning where the electricity is coming from. And as you point out, it's either going to come from A, fossil fuels, or B, nuclear. And I'm not in any way an expert on these things, but it does seem to me that despite the recent, I say recent, several years ago, was it Fukushima power plant issue, which was like a 30 or 40-year-old plant, the modern nuclear power plants are actually reasonably environmental, aren't they? Good for the environment. Well, not good for the environment, but they're not actually a major net drag on the environment, or have I got that wrong?
No, they are. So this is a very interesting page turner in our pursuit of technological salvation. As you said, it's utopian. Often this sort of, I find this is very interesting, this idea, and I'm not dodging your question, but there's an idea that, well, if science hasn't solved the problem, well, they'll figure it out later. This is something of faith. I run into this a lot as a farmer when I tell people that you can't replace cows with synthetic fertilizers, and they say, oh, but we'll figure it out. Are you really going to manufacture microbes and poop in a factory? Now, you were mentioning that you don't know about a lot of this stuff, but that's because you assign it to me, and I have to thank you.
Absolutely
At Liberty
right.
Nation, I do these deep dives, and I go, wow, I didn't even know this about rubber tires, or though I haven't done that piece yet. But I have proposed a piece about these 6 new internationally recognized models for smaller nuclear reactors. There are also major groundbreaking innovations being made almost daily in fusion reactors. we may soon have solar panels that are twice as efficient as the ones we have now. Maybe we should wait a few years and build a billion of those and using coal and all kinds of chemicals. There's an issue here of jumping off the starting line before we even have the technology we have faith in. And so interestingly about nuclear is that the whole world is rethinking nuclear power. And part of that is because of the pollution involved in solar panels and EV cars. Suddenly, those things that were presented as the clean energy alternatives, we're seeing, if we're going to look at the real science, are actually much more polluting than that old, hated nuclear energy. And so many of us are starting to look at, even without the new technologies, storing spent fuel rods is less dangerous than spewing rubber into the oceans and wiping out salmon fisheries, which is what we're doing. So now we only have one real hurdle left for nuclear, and that would be safety. And you're correct. There have been 6 new models, I believe, and they are all much, much safer, if nothing else. They're probably more efficient. The technology is amazing. So, let's not have faith in technology that doesn't exist yet. And let's look at the technologies we have critically to figure out which one is the least destructive. It's kind of like a political election. And I think we end up with nuclear again. The nuclear option is
the nuclear
best.
option. Yeah, let's hope that doesn't make it to the filibuster in the next Senate. But okay, so let's talk about the solar panels. And you say that obviously people are trying to make solar panels more efficient, but and it just seems to me that as they are currently constituted, there's very little possibility that you can gain like double the value within the size that you're getting because of how solar energy and storage actually works. And you'd be tipping the balance between efficiency and collection by trying to almost double the efficiency of a single solar panel, which means inevitably, if I've got that right, which means inevitably that the answer to increasing the output from solar panels is to have more solar panels. Now, the question is, where does that go? Now, and I wonder if what we're seeing is we're actually losing good land that is capable of feeding cows or just being there to regenerate things in favor of these solar panels. Maybe we should be looking at where's a mountain that nobody climbs up and putting things on there. Is it more difficult? Yes. Is it better for the environment long term? Probably. Last 30 seconds or so, John, what's your take on that?
Oh, 30 seconds. Well, actually, there's a big movement to site some of these solar panel sites deep in deserts where they can use them solely for the data processing. They need massive amounts of electricity for. That actually is something being considered. You've thrown a lot of stuff there, but solar panels, once again, they're not all the same, but they do use coal. They do produce a lot of pollution that's non-carbon. And it's Elon Musk who said they've become more efficient. And in a piece I did for Liberty Nation, I used his proposals. We would basically have to put like 11 smallest states in America completely covered in solar panels to supply the energy needs. It's destructive. By the way, they all end up in landfills, not like my solar panels. They're called blades of grass. They grow out of the ground every year. They don't need a Chinese factory or coal, and they go back in the ground. We're replacing all these natural processes. So it won't. How can we ever have enough solar panels unless we have major advances in technology? And even then, as you say, maybe it's not the solution. Maybe we need to manufacture and consume less. Nobody wants to hear that, but maybe that's something we should look at as conservationists or conservatives.
John Clark, thanks ever so much for joining us. And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to mention that Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. I'd also like to thank our guests for today, Sarah Cowgill and John Clark, and most importantly, take a moment to thank you, the listeners out there in Radioland, for tuning in each and every week. You are appreciated.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.